Okay, well, last we left off, we were talking about the various revolutions that followed the Enlightenment period. So, if you look at it in a linear way, you have the Renaissance Reformation happening. Included in this is the expansion of Europe slowly but surely across the world. Um, Also, you have um, Europe within its own borders began to push for a new way of doing science, a new way of doing religion, a new way of doing politics. So that's all kind of moving into the Enlightenment period, and then from there, this movement of ideas starts to produce revolutions. So, like the U.S. American Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolutions, you're going to see tonight, and probably most importantly, the Industrial Revolution, as industry kind of becomes connected to the idea of like what it is to be modern, and so we'll see a lot of that in the 19th century. So, a reaction to the Industrial Revolution is the Romantic period. Now, Romanticism is sometimes seen as the opposite of the Enlightenment, where the Enlightenment focused on science and reason and a way more universal type of thinking. Romanticism was way more focused on the passions, nature, like the natural, and way more nationalistic. So, in some sense, the drumbeat for European nationalism has its roots in Romanticism. Um, what I mean by that is basically you have a lot of this starts in Germany, but you have different philosophers really starting to say like there's something significant about being part of the nation state, so national identity becomes really important here. And as we'll see, it just kind of works its way up. Um, so one way that's typical is in kind of this anti Napoleonic stance that the powers in Europe take in 1815. So with all the turmoil of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars following, um, this then allowed the powers in Europe to some of them actually go back to monarchy, like in France, and we'll see the big struggle throughout the 19th century is to try to realize a true democratic state. Um, so that's Romanticism, and I think the best way to kind of see Romanticism is to kind of understand the literature, the poetry, the art, the music. You can kind of compare and contrast the two. Um, I would say the novel Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a good example of romantic literature. I mean, you kind of see the dangers of too much science in the creation of the monster and the way the monster is rebelling against its creator. So there's a lot of themes in that. Um, and this art piece here, you see, probably dwell on this art piece. You see this figure kind of standing on top of nature, kind of midst of nature, but he obviously is somebody who is upper class or intellectual. So it kind of betrays this kind of sense of modern person, but within nature. And then I'd ask you to definitely get a chance to listen to these two songs here, and you can kind of see the difference between the classical sound, which comes out of the Enlightenment. It's very, very much steady and formed, um, whereas an optimistic, that's what you see in Mozart, and then with Beethoven, you see a lot of like um, go soft, loud, a lot of passion, and in this song. Um, So one of the things that happens, it's almost by accident, is the fact that the rights of women and of slaves get put on the table. This is no thanks to the Enlightenment thinkers themselves. Most of these are upper class European males, and in most cases, they are not involved in trying to have either equality for women in the political realm, even intellectual realm in most cases, or for the equality of slaves or anybody that's not white European male. In fact, a lot of the most famous thinkers, Immanuel Kant, David Hume in particular, um, kind of pushed back against this thought of equality, especially for the slaves. But there is movements to kind of give a voice. Interesting thing, a lot of these movements come out of the Great Awakening, which is a Christian revivalist movement that breaks out in the Anglo-American world, so both in England and the U.S. And because of the moralism being preached there, it really starts to focus in on the slave trade. And women are very much at the forefront of trying to push for its end. So that helps. Women in particular, if you look at what they're pushing for in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century, there's really like two things they're pushing for. One is just the ability to be able to write, own up their own work. You think about like the writings of Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters. In fact, there was not much literary freedom. A lot of the women that we've had to read for literature class in school, in fact, were took on pseudonyms, male names, in order to be taken seriously. So that's just one example. And then as the 19th century moved along, the right to vote was very big on women's consciousness, pretty much until the early 20th century. For abolition, slave trade does end in most cases throughout the early 19th century. And a big component of that is the slave narratives that were being written by former slaves that gained their freedom and could illustrate their own kind of basic rationality. And so that helped to eventually get that abolished. Kind of the tide was turning late 19th century. And in fact, the U.S. is just extremely slow about doing this, whereas the rest of the world was, well, at least England and others were kind of mobilizing to do this in about the 1820s or so, really getting the energy there. Some of this might have to do with probably the greatest revolution that produced equality, and that's the Haitian Revolution. It's a very violent revolution that was led by Toussaint Louverture with a slave revolt on the colony Saint Domingue, which is modern day Haiti. And this was there's a video there to the right you can watch on this. This would eventually yield a constitution, and a constitution that gave rights to the former slaves. So as you obviously know, the American Constitution does not do that, and the Haitian Revolution does. So it's kind of a really significant historical event. Napoleon would actually try to take the island back in the early 19th century once he gained power, but the slaves were able to defeat him and have their freedom. Okay, so finally, last point, for all this stuff that's going along, and you're going to see basically there's a lot of really small reform happening. In fact, a little too slow. And so that's what that ends up happening is it leads to a very radical reaction. So there were a lot of really kind of see the genesis of one liberal reforms within the government, but those are very slow coming. You don't really get like, for example, child labor laws until late 19th century, like in England, and early 20th century in the United States. So like the horrors of labor and industry aren't really being dealt with in the political realm, and people are getting insanely rich off of this. And so that produces political groups like socialists and Marxists. Will eventually be Marxist and anarchist and etc. It's the genesis of all of this is just a bunch of different viewpoints. We pay attention to Marx because he has such a huge influence on the 20th century. So, what is Marx's legacy? Well, Marx decided to like focus in on stages of labor, and so he looked at the relationship basically between the haves and have-nots, or the owners and the workers, and basically came up with a theory on class warfare. Now, the proletariat are the workers who have workers' consciousness, who kind of understand that they're being taken advantage of. And his theory was eventually this group would have a real revolution that will produce a communist world. Now, he wrote, with Friedrich Engels, he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1847 on the eve of the revolutions that broke out in Europe in 1848. These revolutions were ultimately a failure. And in fact, in France, which had already had a kind of a mini revolution in 1830 to overthrow the King Charles X, because after Napoleon, they reinstalled the king. Once he was removed, all they did was make another guy a king. And you can kind of see this story if you've seen Les Miserables, the musical, or read the book. That's what Victor Hugo is talking about, the 1830 revolution. But in 1848, France does it again. There's revolutions spill out all across Europe. They all kind of go nowhere. And basically, most of these revolutions are pushing for some form of liberal Republican reform. But like in France, you have this revolution. It gets put down by the government once more, and Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Napoleon III, creates the Second Republic, and then declares himself emperor in 1851. So, in the heart of the greatest modern revolution in history, you've had nothing but kings and emperors rise up. So this is what kind of produces, I think, the harshness of Marx's critique on trying to do things gradually and piecemeal. What he thinks is that since history works in stages, and we've kind of moved from feudalism, where you basically had like kings and priests and landowners and knights kind of ruling over the land, the peasants all kind of worked on the land. So since you kind of move from there to capitalism, capitalism gives a little bit more freedom and a little more knowledge to the worker that these organized laborers will eventually rise up and overthrow this system. So in his mind, he thought this might happen in like Germany or England. And he was very much involved in this international workers movement, the First Internationale, which lasted from 64 to 76. But that never happened. Again, about the time of his death, France would once again attempt a revolution in Paris. This is the Paris Commune, 1871. This is on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, going very badly for France. The emperor would be dismissed after this war, and you had this even greater attempt at democracy happening there, which again was violently put down. So Marx was actually sometimes somewhat skeptical about this panning out anytime soon, but we'll see. It's going to be one of the big isms, Marxism, one of the big isms, this idea of class warfare, that's going to like basically shake the world in the 20th century.